Good afternoon. Welcome to the afternoon session. I'm Rabbi Naomi Kalish, the Herald and Carole Wolfe, Director of the Center for Pastoral Education here at JTS. I want to echo the sentiments expressed already by our speakers of gratitude to the organizers and leaders of today's program, to Chancellor Schorsch, Rabbi Tucker, Dr. Newman, and so many people here who have brought us together. And I'd also like to thank you for your vision and leadership in imagining this session on trauma. Today we will think about collective trauma as one lens and one approach for understanding the conflict in the Middle East, as well as our own experience here in North America. And it will help us as we imagine and think about a way forward. We have heard from many of our speakers already today referencing trauma in their comments, perhaps most poignantly when we heard from Rabbi Tamara Elad Applebaum, who said, "Where are Israelis today? They are broken." A discussion of trauma constitutes a pivot away from what is often the dominant conversation about the conflict in the Middle East, which focuses on political ideology, a very important conversation. During this conversation, we will address the topic of trauma, which will provide us another approach and another lens for understanding and imagining a way forward. The psychologist James Gilligan, who was a pioneer in the field of psychiatry for understanding violence and preventing it, wrote regarding the United States, if we limit ourselves to the mode of discourse of the criminal legal system in the courtroom, only two questions about violence are admissible: how to distinguish the innocent from the guilty, or what he calls the good guys from the bad guys, and the guilty from the criminally insane. The problem, he writes, with this discourse is that it limits our capacity to understand violence and to prevent it. Gilligan argues for a paradigm shift to public health in which we understand violence through the lens of understanding it as an epidemic. To treat it, we must understand it, its development, its function, and we must make use of healing modalities. In addition, we must seek to understand the barriers that exist to acknowledging, understanding, and addressing the causes of violence and their prevention. In a 2024 study of the experience of PTSD of Israeli and Palestinian children, Dr. Donald Cohen, the founder of the Yale Child Study Center, wrote, "The resolution of intergroup conflict requires the implementation of a psychotherapeutic and socio-educative interventions to transform hate and fear into empathy and hope." Significant to our discussion today, however, is its timing. We are having this discussion exploring the topic of trauma while violence and threat and war continue. Certain aspects of PTSD are not yet fully applicable as the conflict is not yet post. Interwoven in a general conversation about trauma, today's panel will focus on collective trauma, which refers to the impact of traumatic experiences that affect and involve entire groups of people, communities, and society. Our panel includes scholars and practitioners who will discuss how traumatic experiences, historical wrongs, and competing narratives shape the identities, politics, and actions of communities in both the Israeli and Palestinian spaces. By examining the role of memory, fear, and resilience, this session aims to understand the emotional and psychological dimensions of conflict and violence. Our panel includes speakers who bring a combination of personal and professional expertise. Their personal expertise spans Israel, Gaza, and the United States, and professional expertise brings wisdom that reflects and is not limited to historical research, clinical psychiatry and research, political science, and activism. We will hear from David Myers, the Sady and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, Rivka Tuval-Mashiach, a clinical psychologist and professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences, Department of Psychology at Bar-Ilan University, and Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib from the Atlantic Council, who serves as Director of Realign for Palestine. It's now my pleasure to invite the panel to speak. One comment before we begin. If you have questions, please raise your hand and someone will bring you a note card, and then please kindly return the note card to people in the aisles and we will raise those questions. We'll begin with David.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. I want to thank the organizers for actually not only organizing this conference, but really having the wisdom to put together a panel such as this, which is not all that common in considerations of the relations between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. The charge that we received was to begin autobiographically, and at least that I received. So I'd like to just introduce myself and tell you how I relate to the question of trauma. So I'm a modern Jewish historian, which is to say I'm both Jewish in my case and an historian of Jewish history, whose work has dealt with both European Jewish intellectual history and the history of Zionism, Israel, Palestine. And in the course of my work, I was very interested in the question of Jewish awareness of basically, for lack of a better term, the Arab question as it was understood in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And I ended up writing a book about an underappreciated but great Jewish thinker by the name of Shimon Ravidovich, who devoted an entire essay in the early 1950s to the question of what to do with Arab refugees, a question that very few people in Israel or the Jewish world were asking. And this is sort of by way of introduction to my current research, which is very much focused on what I think of as the clash of two large collective traumas, the collective trauma of the Jews issuing from the Holocaust and the collective trauma of Palestinians issuing from the Nakba, beginning in 1948, which I think has continued to reverberate and echo to devastating effect up to the present. So I want to just focus a little bit more on how I sort of came to that particular preoccupation with trauma as an organizing principle. And I'll mention just 3 moments, and Naomi, you'll keep track of time, right? So I think we have 12 minutes to convey our life stories. So the first moment for me was 1982. It's a year when I moved to Israel to commence graduate studies in Jewish history at Tel Aviv University with the intention of moving to Israel permanently as a resident, making Aliyah. It turned out to be a terrible year to consider Aliyah. It was the year of the Lebanon War. It was one of the most divisive times in Israeli history. It was regarded as the conflict was regarded as the first war that did not have a national consensus. And I realized that I could not join the army that was fighting that war. I ended up joining the army of peace demonstrators. But there was one particular moment in that year that really sort of symbolized my own transformation from a rather naive Zionist who had been coming to Israel with some regularity since age 12. And that was a moment, I believe it was September 8th, Saturday, Rosh Hashanah. I was in Jerusalem after shul. I was at a friend's apartment. We hear people on Gaza Road, Derech Gaza, making noise. We go downstairs, we see people in agitated fashion making their way up Derech Gaza to the Prime Minister's house on Balfour Street. And there, when we made it to the Prime Minister's house, I saw something that I had never imagined in my kind of naive Zionist imagination, which was Jews not only shouting at each other, but hitting each other. This was the day during which the news of the massacre in Sabra Shatila had begun to filter down under the Rosh Hashanah kind of embargo of news. And it wasn't yet known who was responsible, what were the circumstances, except that Israel had largely taken over Beirut. And this for me was a moment at which I really felt as if my sort of naive illusions had been shattered. And I had to ask myself a very serious question then and there. Do I close the door and say, Tam b'nishlam, this period in my life is over, or do I have an ongoing and somewhat different relationship to this place, and more importantly, to the complexity of Jews and Arabs in this region? And I happen to answer in the positive, to remain committed in some way. And since that time, I've sort of intermingled both my scholarship and some measure of activism on behalf of peace and reconciliation. The second moment that I want to call our attention to, and there are, needless to say, many moments along the way, but nonetheless, the second moment occurred 30 years later, sometime between 2012 and 2015, when I encountered for the first time a book called Gate of the Sun. I wonder how many of you have heard of Gate of the Sun. Gate of the Sun is the great novel of the Nakba, written by the recently departed Lebanese author Elias Khoury. It is an astonishing piece of literature and brings to one's attention, in ways that one cannot ignore, the experience, the trauma, the sadness, the sense of longing of Palestinians for their land and home, in the most, I would say, empathic and human way. It also reveals something. Khoury's writing here and elsewhere. I recommend to all his trilogy, Children of the Ghetto. 2 of the volumes have come out in English. What Khoury reveals in his work is an enormous sensitivity to the experience of Jews in the Holocaust, and an awareness that consciousness, that Holocaust consciousness, inescapably entered into the attitudes and behavior of Jews in Palestine and then the State of Israel, especially in the year 1948. And it really crystallized for me the wisdom of what the eminent Palestinian-American scholar and literary critic Edward Said once described as the phenomenon of victims when describing Palestinians. Now, some here may say that's an affront. How could we not hold on to the exclusive right to victimhood as Jews, which is already, as you can hear in my formulation, a pretty dangerous claim. But what I think we want to recognize is Khoury and Said, and for that matter, Hassan Kanafani and Emil Habibi and Mahmoud Darwish, a whole generation of Palestinian and Arab intellectuals understood that Jews were victims. And indeed, that victimhood had consequences for Palestinians. Something somewhat uncomfortable to think about, the connection between the Shoah and the Nakba, but I don't think we can ignore it any longer. And that's because of the third moment that I want to call our attention to. How am I doing on time, Naomi?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. October 7th. I, like everybody here, was shattered at the news, and in the first days after, quite furious at my erstwhile allies for not condemning October 7th. And yet, in those first days after, I also recognized that what was likely to happen is that Israel, especially under Netanyahu, and the Israeli army would act out of a sense of obligation, but really out of blind vengeance. And indeed, Benjamin Netanyahu said on October 7th, "We will act out of mighty vengeance," his words. And indeed, that is what happened. What I'd like to suggest is that October 7th represented almost the perfect re-triggering of Holocaust trauma, right? Frequent references to the Holocaust, the deadliest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, and that what occurred subsequently in Israel's devastating assault on Gaza, particularly the displacement of 2 million Palestinians, re-triggered in very profound fashion memories of the Nakba. And so we have another playing out, but on a scale and magnitude far greater than before, these originary traumas of 1948. And this leads me to my final point, and we'll, I hope, have time to elaborate. What has become clear to me as an historian is we need to write a different kind of history of the relationship or a conflict. Some people don't like the term conflict. I do use that term. A psychological history of the conflict, one that recognizes the centrality of trauma. Trauma, from the Greek word, which means wound, emotional wounds that induce fear, anxiety, and often rage. And those qualities or characteristics lead to dehumanization and blindness. And I fear that is where we are at today, and we need to understand much better how we got there from that critical foundational turning point of 1948. So a new psychological history of the conflict. That's the project I'm embarked upon. Thank you.
Hi. I'll tell you a bit about myself before I'll dive into the topic. I'm a clinical psychologist. My expertise is in trauma. I've been treating trauma patients for more than 30 years. I started in the Hadassah Medical Hospital as a young intern in the 90s, where I met the survivors of all the bus bombings in Jerusalem, and later on the survivors of the Second Intifada. So I am quite familiar with waves of terror in Israel and working with many survivors, not only of terror attacks, but also of the different wars. I'm the chief psychologist of a big trauma organization, which is called Natal. Natal was established to treat the veterans of the Yom Kippur War who found themselves 20 and 25 years after the war suffering from what they learned is PTSD. They didn't know PTSD existed after the Yom Kippur War. And since then, we treat the survivors and the veterans and the families of all the war and terror in Israel. So my first response was to Naomi when we had the preparatory conversation was that for me, the question is not how collective trauma impacts the conflict, because it's not a unidirectional path. It's a spiral, because the conflict impacts collective trauma. And then, in turn, collective trauma impacts the way we treat the conflict. And it goes on and on for years, as I just told you, I saw in my eyes. So I think it's a much, much more complicated issue. We are coping with both sides, Palestinians and Israelis and Jews all over the world. We cope with waves of conflict that lead to trauma, and then, of course, it affects the way we go back to deal with the conflict. So that's one. The second thing is that I think that we need to define what collective trauma means. And I'll just start by saying a few words about individual trauma, because for me it lays the basis for how I understand collective trauma. So when we speak about individual trauma, we speak about an event that threatens either the physical existence or the emotional existence of the individual. And it really triggers a variety of responses. Many of them you're familiar with, like avoidance or flashbacks or the difficulty to tolerate and regulate emotions. But these are all normal responses. And the majority of people who are exposed directly or indirectly to traumatic events will recover without any treatment or help. October 7th confronted us with a different type of trauma. And I think it makes our collective trauma much more difficult. First, it involves many, many types of stressors. It's the missiles, it's the relocated families, it's of course the hostages, it's the murder of whole families, it's the threat on the kibbutzim for many, many, many hours and days, it's sexual trauma, it involves sadism and exposure of all of us, or those of many of us, to the films and the media that was published by the terrorists. And most important, it hasn't ended. So when we speak about traumatic events, we usually tend to see them as something that starts and has an end, and then we can speak about post-trauma or recovering from the trauma. But when the trauma doesn't end and we are still in it, it's very difficult to speak about our responses. Are they normal in this situation? Are they already post? Are we able to start conversation about the conflict when we are still in the war? And I want to say something very personal about myself, because I think it has to do with the discussion. I'm Israeli, as you know. I'm a clinical psychologist. I live in Israel. I am a mother for 4 children. 2 of them are my sons. One of them has been in the reserves for more than 250 days since the start of the war. He has a son who was born while he was away, his first son. My youngest is an active duty soldier who was on October 7th in another place and almost got killed when he was taken to the Alumim kibbutz, and his helicopter was bombarded by the Hamas terrorists. So I find myself in a very complex situation where I treat survivors. Some of them are my friends, my son friends, and I am directly exposed to the missiles at my home, and I am professionally treating clients, and I am a mother of sons who are in danger all these 18 months. And this is the point where I want to ask you to think about how we need to think about the conversation and the dialogue. I do believe in a dialogue. I just want you to understand how complicated it is to do it when we are still on war. And if we take the core of the experience of trauma, of individual trauma, the basic core for me is that it shatters many, many important layers of our lives. It shatters our basic assumptions of the world, of its goodness, of how safe it is for us to be in this world. It shatters our narrative, because we need to understand what happened before, where we're going from here. It shatters meanings. And of course, naturally, as trauma is shattering the sense of control and agency, it takes our agency away from us. And it shatters our trust in others, especially the in the perpetrators, but also in those who were supposed to keep us safe and didn't. So when we translate, and I try, this is what I'm trying to do when I move from the individual level to the collective level, when we move from the individual level to the collective, we need to ask the question of how can we define a collective trauma? In what ways does collective show its symptoms? In what way does a society present its symptoms? We cannot speak about intrusiveness, we cannot speak about avoidance in the same way that we can speak when we speak about individuals. So I'd like to point out, and I think the previous panel about the art and the artifacts really helps me with that, because what culture does, what collective do, they define for us how we should interpret what happened, why did it happen, what does it mean for us as a collective. If you just think of one picture that comes up to you when you think of 9/11, I think that without asking or without the time to listen to what your answer would be, we all have one picture in mind. And that's because this is the cultural myth, or this is the cultural memory, or this is the collective memory that we have. It's the same if I ask you, what's the picture that comes up to you when you think of the Holocaust? I think the majority would have the picture of the child with his hands raised, right? It's because we have collective memories. And I think because we are so close to Pesach, I think it's important to mention that as Jews, part of our collective memory is about these stories of being hated by others, of being victims, of being able to overcome all the hate and wars, but this is part of a story that has prices as well. And I think that, just a second, I think that my main issue with defining collective trauma is because I think that we can't speak, and I'm sad to say it, but I think we cannot speak about collective trauma of Israelis because we have different collectives in Israel. And we have different collectives in Israel even before October 7th, okay? We have different narratives within our society. What it means is that we don't have a definitive collective memory of what happened, and we don't have a definitive narrative of where should we go from here, or why did it happen, or what's the next step? Do we have to first bring the hostages, or do we first have to win the war? We have opposing narratives, so we cannot speak about collective trauma. We can speak about collective or trauma of different collectives, and that's a big problem, because if we have, as we had, 2 memorial ceremonies in the first year, which were separate. One was the official one, and the other one was the alternative one. It means that in 10 years, we won't have a memorial day to remember as a group what it means. I'll stop with that, and we'll come back when we have time.
Good afternoon. My name is Ahmed, and before I start, I just want to share a couple of things. Am I too close? Am I too loud? I can't hear myself. Okay. 2 things real quick. First is that I am not a trained psychologist, nor am I coming at this from an official lens. I am coming at this as an average individual with steeped in, speaking from a background that's steeped in lived experience, growing up in Gaza, having had family in Gaza that suffered immensely during this current war and lost immensely and faced horrendously, horrendous suffering. Number two is that I'm speaking for myself. I've never once claimed to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people or speaking for them or above them. And I would encourage you to be very wary of anybody who claims to speak for the Palestinian people, even if they have a group or if they have an organization. So for me, my unusual lived experience was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing in that it created a kind of physical endpoint for the trauma, even though it didn't, the curse is that it didn't actually end that for my family and loved ones. And what do I mean by that? So I'm 34. I feel like I'm 64 in a 34-year-old body. But I came to the United States when I was 15. I came here in 2005 as a 15-year-old exchange student with a State Department program. It was a one-year high school exchange, live with a host family, be with an American host mom or family, and go to high school, and then go back to your respective homelands and build cultural bridges. It was a post 9/11 initiative to repair some of the damage, if you will, from 9/11. But upon completing the program, I was stuck in Egypt, unable to go into Gaza when Hamas abducted Gilad Shalit, a young Israeli soldier, and that resulted in a border closure. Hamas had already won the infamous 2006 elections, and then there was a mini war after Gilad Shalit, and then I was in Egypt and came back to the United States thanks to the support of allies and human rights and peace activists, and applied for and received political asylum status. And the very day of my asylum interview was June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip and ejected the Palestinian Authority. So while I was in the Gaza Strip, I grew up with the very, very ubiquitously taught sense of collective trauma when it comes to the Nakba, when it comes to the sense of displacement, when it comes to the idea that we are a displaced, dispossessed people that have been wronged by the Arabs, by the Ottomans, then by the Brits, then by the Arabs and Muslims, then by the Israelis, then by our own leadership. And there was a crossroads, if you will, with the Palestinian Authority. I experienced the tail end of Oslo in the 90s, where we ditched the Egyptian travel documents. Gaza had a short-lived airport that I flew into in 99 and in 2000. We had an ID card, so there was like collective trauma was gradually giving way to a sense of collective sovereignty. We were sovereign. We were here, we had IDs, we had slight control of our destiny, of our territories. And then, unfortunately, in Camp David in 2000, things didn't work out too well. When Arafat walked away from that, the Second Intifada, the militarization of the Second Intifada, then that was the first experience, I would say, for me, viscerally, of direct physiological trauma. There were multiple horrendous experiences, but one particular near-death experience that planted the seed for me to leave the Gaza Strip was in 2001. It was actually 2 months after 9/11, at the age of 11 in 2001, when I was going home from school and with some friends, and happened to pass by a building that was hit by an airstrike, and I've actually written about this in Haaretz and Times of Israel. The first time I publicly wrote about this was in 2017, ironically, for Israeli press. Sorry, I'm just going to do this here so that I could see you and folks. And that actually mattered to me. Sorry, that actually mattered to me to be able to talk about it to an Israeli Jewish audience. The selection of Haaretz as a vehicle to publicly talk about that experience as part of the pursuit of healing was very deliberate. And so it was, and yeah, so it killed two of my friends and rendered me largely deaf in my left ear. That's why I tend to yell. I can't hear myself. And the concussive blast from the wave caused me a TBI in my left side. And it was then that I really was determined to get out of Gaza. And I turned to English as a tool to try and just maximize my opportunities to leave the coastal enclave. And thankfully, 4 years later, I was able to depart. So again, that was a physical endpoint to my own trauma. But my family, I have two brothers, two sisters. My father, who passed away 5 years ago, he was an UNRWA director. He was a doctor in the Jabalia refugee camp up north. My oldest brother is currently in Gaza right now. He runs a British medical NGO. My baby sister left Gaza in 2016. She's in Jerusalem. She's a cancer researcher. And I have a sister in the UAE. And my middle brother, he was a doctor for UNRWA, and he left. He ran the beach camp, and he left and went over to Germany like 1 year before October 7th. And so they experienced the rise of Hamas they experienced the collapse of Gaza basically under Hamas's rise, with all the wars, with the blockade, with all the restrictions, with the poverty, with the horrendous degradation of the quality of life, with the poor, the worsening of not just the conditions, but basically the stalemate that hit the Palestinian National Project as a whole, and all the associated trauma that became 10x what it was when I lived there. So there was kind of these competing tracks where I worked on myself when I came here. My US host mother was a former Catholic nun turned Buddhist atheist guru. She was very San Francisco. She was the oldest of 14 from Louisville, Kentucky. And like very Tibetan Buddhism, whatever. But it was wonderful for me in this. I grew up in a very, very devout Muslim family. And, I'm spiritual about Islam, but I'm certainly not very ritualistic in my commitment to Islam, if I will. And so I learned meditation. I learned that Buddhism is actually a philosophy, and that you don't, I used to think of Buddhism as turning over to Buddha statues and praying to Buddha, whatever. So that helped me, in addition to therapy, in addition to Zoloft, in addition to everything else, in addressing my trauma as my family's trauma was worsening. And unfortunately, I was volunteering, helping young people in Gaza learn English, helping young people try to develop computer skills, try to develop something to avoid radicalization. And I saw what was happening in Gaza. I saw people turning to what little options they had. And it was sad, and it was heartbreaking. And then moving over, fast forward to October 7th, and unfortunately, as soon as the disaster started unfolding, I immediately knew that Gaza as we knew it would cease to exist, and that my family, like millions of people in the Gaza Strip would pay a heavy price for Hamas's suicidal nihilism. I had been tracking different developments in the lead up to October 7th that made me concerned about Hamas trying to sabotage the prospects of Saudi-Israeli normalization, about the fact that Hamas was actually, their popularity was in the toilet, and their popularity, there were mass protests against them in July and August of 2023. And that their popularity was low. The unemployment was 70% for youth, up to 80%, 50% unemployment, 8 hours of electricity a day, horrendous suffering. And still, Gaza was a beautiful place that meant so much to its people that did not need to be destroyed at the behest of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I was horrified by not just Hamas's actions, but by the traumatizing of the communities all around Gaza, the kibbutzim, like the stories that you hear of folks in kibbutz Be'eri and in kibbutz Nahal Oz and all those areas helping out the Gazans with the cancer patients and whatever. That's not some Haaretz propaganda. That was actually like my dad, who the UNRWA did nothing for him when he was sick. And he was getting treatment entirely for free at Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem. And folks from Kibbutz Be'eri were helping him out for free, entirely selflessly. And Kibbutz Be'eri was one of the worst hit by Hamas's violent, horrendous attack. And so for me, it was, there was just like so much horror. So anyway, I just fast forward. Sorry, I'm used to talking about it in terms of trauma. One of the things that I wanted to do that was different is that I wanted to connect with survivors and their families and families of hostages as a way to build bridges, to say, I'm terribly sorry for what happened to your loved ones, to be that one Gazan voice that certainly, while it's not my responsibility per se, I did feel a sense of a broader collective responsibility, even as I was furious at the fact that the war, just as I had predicted, ended up killing dozens of my immediate and extended family members. My childhood homes, but 2 of them were destroyed in Gaza City up north. My brother that I told you about is in Gaza right now. I took my mom and his wife and 4 children out on October 13th. Our family home was destroyed. And I know there was a follow-on airstrike that destroyed the neighborhood. And my brother was in the house when it was hit. And he and his wife and 4 children pushed their way out of the rubble. My uncle Riyadh was my dad's youngest brother, was killed. And he spoke perfect Hebrew. He used to work in Israel. Once upon a time, my 12-year-old niece was killed. Farah, she was survived by her identical twin, Marah, who was badly disabled. My cousin Isra, my first cousin, my uncle, my dad's niece, she was thrown out of the building. A concrete slab fell on her, crushed her, and turned her into a quadriplegic. And she survived that. And then on December 14th, 2023, a massive Israeli airstrike in Rafah, before the invasion of Rafah, killed 29 of my mom's family. My second home wiped out all of my aunts and uncles in that home, destroyed that house. The New York Times, Amnesty International, Foreign Policy, all did investigations and wrote high-profile pieces and asked the IDF, asked the Israeli military. I gave them coordinates. I gave them times. I gave them, like, everything. Said, just, do you know why was this hit? And the Israeli military had no answers whatsoever, despite the fact that I had been ferociously anti-Hamas through and through, and remain so to this very day. And so I was at a crossroads, trauma-wise, and decided that, trauma-wise, and when it comes to my commitment to peace, my commitment to healing and reconciliation. And that's no kumbaya. That's not like, oh, let me just say this. And like, this is hard work. This takes a daily commitment to this ethos, to not give up and to lead by example, because you have an entire population in the Gaza Strip right now that are completely, horrendously traumatized at every conceivable level. If just 1% of this population was incited to seek revenge, we are screwed. There will never be peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Our work is cut out for us in terms of how are we going to sustainably absorb some of those energies, work with some of the grievances. Forget we're talking about historical traumas and the Nakbas, and yes, what David said, that we're triggered horrendously by this. I mean, numerically speaking, over 2 million people were displaced internally in this in a way that far surpasses the numbers of the Nakba. But forget the Nakba. I'm talking about right now in terms of, I talk to dozens and dozens of people in Gaza on a regular daily basis. My brother is in there right now, and 10 years ago, and I'm almost done, I swear. 10 years ago, I tried to build an internationally run, Israeli-approved airfield in Gaza to facilitate the freedom of movement in and out of Gaza, because part of my theories of change for Gaza and how do you sustainably de-radicalize is Gaza's always been isolated, always stuck between, it has like an unhealthy codependency on Israel and Egypt to get in and out. And so if you open it up through the airspace overlooking the Mediterranean, but anyway, what that experience did was I developed an army of volunteers and informants and allies and people on the ground. And what they're telling me right now is the amount of abuse, for example, like the abuse that the children are experiencing, both physical in terms of beatings, the sexual abuse that the children, the displaced children are experiencing, the children who are regularly separated from their family members and have to sell, beg, go fetch food, go fetch water, etc. Again, in a war zone with no adult supervision, completely vulnerable to exploitation. Number two, the amount, I mean, Secretary Blinken came to the Atlantic Council where I work on his like second to last day and gave that speech where he infamously said, we assess that Hamas has been able to recruit as many fighters as it has lost during the war. Now, you look at a lot of the images, those fighters look like a bunch of children. I mean, and I've literally looked at these, I've looked at dozens and dozens of hours, but there's this trauma, this untreated trauma in a society that has historically been very reluctant to dealing with mental health issues and been told, oh, you don't need no Zoloft or pill or therapy, just say a couple of prayers, So we have our work cut out for us in understanding this from a clinical point of view and then feeding that understanding into a comprehensive political plan for addressing the day Gaza in the day after. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our panel for bringing such complexity and depth to this conversation. And at this point, I'd like us to turn directly to the questions from the audience. So as a reminder, please raise your hand if you have a question and you'll receive a note card.
And please ask a question just for the sake of, yes?
Sure.
Please ask a question, don't make long statements. I think microphone is fine. It's up to you, but microphone is fine. Just for speed, right?
Yeah. They were going to write the questions, but we can.
Hand them out. Okay, and then just gather them and someone reads them. Okay.
They were going to write the questions and
Perfect.
gather them.
While we're
Well, while we wait for the first question, let me ask the panel if any of you have responses to your colleagues on the panel.
Sure. I'm going to jump in and say that one of the things that I think we need is actually more encounters such as this, where Israelis and Palestinians listen to the stories of the other. And I think it's really important that we have staged that here. I will, I suppose, take exception to, or offer an alternative to things that both of my colleagues said, insofar as I would never surrender, because it's a matter of vocational necessity, the importance of history, to our understanding of the ongoing power of trauma, because history is so very often invoked, and we need to get a more textured understanding of history and how it operates in order to be in a position to actually, in some sense, neutralize its weaponization. And I guess to Rivka, I would say, I don't know whether what we're witnessing fits the DSM definition of trauma, but there's certainly a cultural phenomenon out there, and I think you gave voice to it in describing your own experience as a mother, that certainly seems to me like a collective version of trauma. If one goes to Israel and talks to people, one senses, without much scratching, the depth of anxiety, fear, rage, and for that matter, a pretty large inability to understand suffering on the other side. These, to me, seem to be markers of a deep collective trauma that, let it be said, has been triggered through its own, within Israel, through a process of political weaponization, but also has its own very deep roots. And I think unless and until we acknowledge that this fear and rage and anxiety has roots and deleterious consequences, there's going to be no internal healing within Israel, and there's certainly going to be no significant progress towards any kind of meaningful reconciliation. And the criterion by which I guess I would measure that capacity to overcome that sense of collective trauma would be the beginning of a process of rehumanization of the other. And that's where I think we have to get. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, actually.
Sure. I totally agree, David. I just want to add that for me, I think what is necessary for more encounters like that is a perspective. And perspective means that it's extremely difficult to be on site when you are afraid, when you run away because of a missile, when your son is in danger. You need either a perspective of time. Usually, all the conversations that were successful of peace and reconciliation were after many, many years have passed, or geographical perspective. I think it's not. I think it's clear that we are here now in the U.S. able to have this conversation, right? So maybe it's a geographical location that makes it possible. And it's much more difficult now, this day, to have this conversation in Israel. Maybe the solution would be to, and I with my whole heart, I am for more dialogues like this, but maybe for the time being, we need to have them a bit far away to be able to conduct them.
So JTS should hold more of these kinds of gatherings.
Yes,
I think
that's for that.
Julie, I think that's the message.
All right, we have a couple of questions. I don't know if we'll get to them all. Let me read a few of them, and then we'll see how they get answered. Here's an interesting one. How does collective trauma manifest for Palestinian citizens of Israel? And how might this be different from other Palestinians in the territories, particularly in Gaza, or from other Israelis? Is there something specific to that? Another question is, what is there to learn from other situations of conflict and reconciliation, like India, Pakistan, similarly long ongoing conflict between two peoples in one land? We can think of some other examples of that in the world. Very directly, what resources are available to Israelis, Israeli Arabs, and Gazans? Is there a shortage of mental health professionals? Is there a shortage of medications, et cetera? So that'll get us started.
Who would like to begin? Ahmed?
I'll just mention, I mean, what's interesting is that there's an entire dynamic in the diaspora that I understand why our folks are having a hard time in the land. There's a war, there's suffering, there are hostages. I am willing to understand why it's difficult, even though I understand that there are actually conversations still happening. They might not be on a large scale, they're smaller scale conversations, but fine. The thing that's frustrating for me is that those of us who have, let's just call it diaspora / Western privilege and safety here, and are creating all of these unnecessary barriers to having these conversations such that we can build up these resources for our respective peoples. That's the part that really gets me, especially on the Palestinian side. And the number of times I've been in conversations where I have attempted to kind of to create said spaces. Well, let's put it this way. The number of times I've had, let me just speak on the Palestinian side. I've had US officials in Washington, that's where I live, I'm in Washington, who are like, dude, I want to be briefed by Palestinian Americans and Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. I want to hear the raw story of what's happening in Gaza, and this was more true with the last administration. No offense to fans of the current administration, that's fine. You know, I'm nonpartisan, I'm bipartisan, and all of that. But he was like, first of all, I can't have people yell at me. Every time I would try to have folks brief me, they would yell at me. Second of all, every other word would be genocide this, Zionist that. And third of all, the only policy recommendation that existed was cut off all funding to Israel. And he's like, that's not a tenable policy recommendation. He's like, tell me, allocate this funding for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for this medical clinic, for this route, for this. And yours truly was a key player in pushing for the establishment of the food drops and the maritime corridor. And I had some of the most ferocious attacks against me as a Zionist sellout, traitor, whatever, because of that work. But what folks didn't understand is that there was a much bigger play here, which is that Gaza's airspace went from being, sorry, I'm deviating, I'm gonna come back to this, I promise. There was the airspace over Gaza went from being under the exclusive control of the Israeli airspace for over 24 years to all of a sudden we had the air forces of 10 different countries operating freely over Gaza. I mean, in full coordination with Israel. But I humbly was able to prove that if you coordinate with Israel, all the relevant security matters, Gaza's airspace and Gaza's territorial waters can be open for business. So that's what I'm desperately trying to get the folks in the diaspora to do with a whole host of other issues, including but not limited to mental health issues, the think tank world. Do you know that most wealthy Arab and Palestinian Americans don't have a clue what a lot of think tanks do in Washington? They complain about AIPAC, they complain about the ADL, they complain. And I'm like, okay, I'm at the Atlantic Council. Let's set up a program at the Wilson Center, at this, at that, and come up with policy recommendations. Start designing programs. Start designing specific things that help Gaza, that help the youth, that de-radicalize our youth, that do 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's the thing that frustrates me the most. I think I'm imagining you probably might have an easier time getting some Israelis in the United States mobilized to get some, resources dedicated to mental health.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think even if you take even if you take Israelis from Israel now and bring them, as it was many, many years ago in the conversations and dialogues with the Nazi second generation sons and daughters, when you took them out of Israel where they can breathe, because we are now in a survival mode, which really limits our cognitive capacity. I'm very optimistic that such conversation can start. I don't know if here, but somewhere else. We just need perspective. But I want to answer one of the questions that you asked about what works when such conversations succeed. And I can speak about what I see as the prerequisite for success. I think of 3 aspects. One is compassion. I think Abba Tamar spoke about mercy. I would switch the word to compassion. I don't think it's mercy. I think it's just being really able to put aside our judgment and our immediate comparisons about who suffers more, and just being able to listen to each other. Just listen. And Ahmed, we spoke before, and I'm really, really in pain, and I'm sorry for your losses. And it has nothing to do with the fact that, that I'm mourning my losses, my own losses. It's not competing. And I think that as long as we can sit and just listen to each other, it brings it to the second point, which is that a necessary part for healing from trauma, whether it's individual or collective, is to be validated. Because like it happens with a gaslighting experience, when we go through trauma, we lose trust in ourselves and in what happened, and we need the audience to really just listen and believe and validate our experience. And if we are willing to be witnesses for each other and witnesses to our own experience, then it's a huge step. I mean, it's even before finding the political solution to this situation, which is so complicated, just validating the pain and the sorrow and the losses. And the third thing, and this is maybe the most difficult one, is to keep hope. I meet with so many Israelis. I'm not sure they are broken, but I'm really, really sad that many tell me that they lose hope. And if we lose hope, then we lose everything in the world. And I think hope, as Snyder, the prominent psychologist, reminds us, is different than optimism. Optimism means that tomorrow will be better. And optimism is a given. You're either born optimistic or not, and you cannot change it. But hope is a different thing. Hope means that you think of where you want to be in the future, and you know that to get there, you have to be part of it, and you have to have the motivation and the faith and the commitment to do something to help us be there. So truly, I think that, these conversations just make me much more hopeful than before. That's it.
I want to just echo the importance of hope and add a qualifier to that idea of hope, something which my teacher, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, discussed in trying to understand the yawning chasm between cataclysm and messianism. What do we hold on to in that intermediate space? And he came up with the idea of interim hope, like hope that is sort of time-bound and lives in reality. And I think we have to aspire to more of that kind of interim hope. But I want to address, if I may, just very quickly, the two questions that were asked. Palestinian citizens of Israel, an extraordinary complex position. And I should say that tomorrow you'll have the privilege of hearing from one of my dearest friends and a brilliant scholar and activist, Dr. Nasreen Yahya, who will be speaking. And she and a number of other my closest Israeli friends who happen to be Palestinian citizens of Israel really represent the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in and of themselves. So on one and the same time, they're citizens of Israel. They are often questioned about their loyalty to both Israel and the Palestinian national movement. And yet, at the same time, they possess, very often, the kind of sense of complexity that allows for recognition of, and here's the key term, the dignity of all human life. Meaning, many Palestinian citizens of Israel had friends who were murdered on October 7th. And many had family and friends who were killed in Israel's devastating assault on Gaza. And what that means is moving past the zero-sum proposition that was spoken of earlier that's so ubiquitous in our understanding of the conflict. In that regard, it may be the Palestinian citizens of Israel, as has been suggested before, may be ideal mediators between these two experiences, these two traumas. In their case, in sort of living with both of these traumas doesn't have the effect of doubling the depth of the trauma, but in some sense, allowing for a much deeper compassion. And so I would suggest that that this may be, what seems to be burdensome position may actually be a boon to some measure of overcoming and working through this very profound trauma. A question was, what are other examples? So one thing, and I think Rivka hinted at this, is it's very hard to engage in the kind of work that has to be done unless you're in a post-conflict situation. But we have no choice, so we have to assume that there are things we can do, even if not in a post-conflict situation. What we do know is that there are many strategies that have been deployed in places like Northern Ireland and the Balkans, post-war Poland, and a lot of them have to do with educational and curricular innovations as a way of overcoming the exclusivity of each group's guiding narrative. And what experience shows, and there's a lot more to be said about this, is it's very often one step forward and two steps backward. But there really is no choice but to continue with these strategies to overcome the exclusivity of self-identity and the zero-sum thinking that has been so toxic, and really the cycle of violence by which victim becomes victimizer and then victim again, and on it goes.
So we are almost at our time limit, and I feel like our conversation could continue twice as long. We've had a discussion about pain during this time, the pain of trauma as extends to many other levels and layers of pain. And in this conversation, I've heard from the questions and from the panelists a sense of hope and desire to continue. And we've heard these words of dialogue and compassionate listening, bearing witness, affirming, and a recommendation we need to do more of this. This conversation has reminded me of a teaching by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in which he distinguishes two different kinds of peace. And so one is what he refers to as the prophetic vision of peace, which is very utopian. I was thinking of it earlier today when we talked about, one of the speakers spoke about the shoulds. You know, we have this vision of what it should be, but how do we actually get there? And so that's the other conception of peace, which comes from the rabbinic expression, mipnei darchei shalom, things that we do for the sake of peace or of peace building. And in the many different examples that are given in rabbinic literature, there's the inclusion of acts of kindness and care, of showing up for people during times of illness and showing up for people in times of bereavement and other aspects of caregiving. So I think sometimes there's a pragmatism in this, and this is what we've also been discussing. What is actually possible for us today, this evening, tomorrow, as we continue to walk through this experience and this very difficult and painful and conflicted time. So I'd like to end with an announcement that JTS will be offering a series of webinars which extend some of these conversations. And regarding this panel, there will be a conversation which highlights the field of livui ruchani, of spiritual caregiving in Israel, and it will be a conversation among chaplains and caregivers. And I think with this program that we'll be presenting is embedded the idea that compassionate listening and bearing witness are not innate and they're not easy, but they're capacities that we grow and develop. And I'm so grateful for our panel today and for each of you for sharing so much. And I have grown and really been edified by each of your presentations and wisdom, and really feel I have sat among amazing people who have dedicated yourself to this work. So thank you. And now I believe we have a reception.
Everyone is invited outside to a reception out in the atrium. And note that the Bernard Siegel lecture and our distinguished lecturer, Professor Mandelblit, who's right in front of me here, begins at 5:15.